Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Beit Midrash. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's feeling good, and hope everybody's having a good week so far. And if you're not, today is Thursday, and you know what the best part about Thursday is?
Day before Shabbat.
Tomorrow's Friday, exactly. And then it's Shabbat. So you're almost if it's been a rough week, you're almost at the end. And if you're having a good week, you're still almost at the end, and that's okay too. So we're glad you're here to join us in learning today. So we're on chapter 5 in God of Becoming and Relationship, dealing with what philosophers like to fancily call theodicy. More simply called the problem of evil. So, in short, what's the problem of evil in typical philosophical theology?
The question of why, if God is good, why does he let evil happen?
Good. So if you have an all-knowing, all-good, all-powerful God, why does evil exist in the world? If God is all good, then God should stop evil from happening, especially if God knows it's going to happen and has the power to stop it. Then why does it exist at all? That's kind of the general problem as it's defined in typical theology and typical philosophy. Or more simply, as Harold Kushner, Zichrono Livracha, wrote, why bad things happen to good people. That's not exactly the title of his book, but it's close. Good book, by the way, if you haven't read it. But process theology doesn't hold by those same philosophical premises. It doesn't hold, as we've been learning the last few weeks. It doesn't hold for an all-powerful, all-knowing God. So therefore, why does evil exist in the world? And that's kind of the topic that Rabbi Artson's trying to tackle today. So, comments, thoughts, questions, reflections on this chapter before we kind of dive in. Yes, Cindy.
I found it very unsatisfying, and it made me angry.
Because
it really didn't give me any kind of better answer than what we just got rid of. Saying the all-knowing God, whatever. It still doesn't explain the inexplicable. I mean, you're talking about, God forbid, childhood cancer, what happened to our dear friend Debbie Thomas. I mean, I'm feeling all that right now, and this doesn't help. But I'm a skeptic, so
So, with that, what does he say are the realities of evil and suffering? It doesn't have to be just Cindy. Anybody can join in.
Well, it's just that we're not paying attention. We miss the opportunity to do the right thing, or our perspective is off. I mean, that was the worst part of it. When he talks about Maimonides, and evil is simply our perspective on a particular event. I mean, that really set me off.
I had some trouble with, I guess, the definition of evil. I do not equate evil and suffering in the same way. Evil is man-made and can be avoided. Suffering and I think he was trying to say this in the book, shit happens. Life is a constant tension between, life and death and, things evolving. And when things evolve, there's always loss. I get suffering. I get that. It's evil that I think I'm kind of with Cindy on. There's no perspective issue on Nazi Germany. I mean, I'm sorry. That's just evil.
Well, Esther, I agree with you, except for the end statement. I think there is a perspective. It's just that we don't, that hopefully most people can't wrap their minds around it. But the Nazis and Hitler had no problem
You're right.
with seeing the perspective that getting rid of vermin is a good thing.
Right. You're right. I don't like the perspective. I think that perspective is evil. That's what I would call evil.
Right. But basically evil is whatever we say it is. As unfortunately, good is also whatever we say it is, in my opinion. I don't
philosophically, that's not a very satisfying place to be in. But I hear what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah. It's not satisfying, and I don't like that. I don't like it, but I don't see a way around it personally. And I don't see, I love the becoming part of the philosophy and totally agree with it. Every moment is a potential, or is a creative recreating, and we are co-creating. I like all of that. But when he decides or says one way of thinking about this is that a person making bad choices, that's proximate, he says, which means within nature. But then he calls the good choice responding to the divine lure. But then the assumption is that's not proximate within our nature. So it seems a contradiction to me.
I say, where are you?
I'm on page 33. Let's see, where does he say this? Okay, so in the paragraph that starts, the dynamic ephemeral nature of becoming, the competing lures that tempt us and distract us from God's lure. And then in the middle of that page, it says process theology allows us to recognize their sources, meaning poor diet choices, etc., bad choice for companionship or community. That process theology allows us to recognize those sources of those choices as proximate within nature and not as the judgment or punishment of the divine. That part I agree with. But then he goes on to say that the good choices are basically motivated by the divine lure to freely choose and affirm those relations. So I do agree we have choices, but not this. I don't understand this, why he makes a distinction between a bad choice that's from within and a good choice that's from the within responding to the lure of God. So they're both within.
I think I understand your question.
Good.
So let's back up and let's maybe walk through. And TK, if I'm forgetting to answer your question, remind me and I'll come back to it.
I'm not sure what my question is, but okay.
Just say, you haven't answered my question yet, and then I'll come back to try to answer it.
Okay.
So what a lot of what he's trying to do here is less give an answer and more break down a break down what he, I think, sees as problematic theology. So I think a large part of what he's trying to do is say, you know, there's a section of Talmud that says, if something bad happens to you and you get sick, you should evaluate what you did. You should evaluate your deeds and see what you did wrong to cause it. And if that doesn't work, then you should, think about your prayer life and whether you've done something in your prayer life that might have caused it. That's the kind of theology he's trying to break away from, and he's trying to argue against, to say that when something bad happens, something you did something something to deserve it. I like to tell this story. I recently told somebody this story, so it's in my mind. I was fortunate enough to not have this happen to me, but I have heard rumors that Rabbi Artson, in rabbinical school interviews, the very first question he would ask when the prospective student sat down was to say, I have twin children. My daughter is neurotypical and my son is autistic. What did I do wrong? And, wait for them to come up with a coherent answer. As I said, very grateful he never did that to me. But, that's the kind of theology he's arguing against, to say, you must have done something wrong to deserve this. And so he's arguing, there's evil is one. He says there's two views of why evil exists. One is that there's a part of creation that either has not been accessed, that doesn't, acknowledge what God wants us to do, or outwardly rejects it. In some sense, to Esther's point before, that's where I think a lot of, that's where Nazism comes into play. It's the outward rejection of what God actually asks of us to do, and making a conscious choice to reject it. That's a major source of evil. The other one is a matter of perspective. Now, here's kind of what I'll say on the perspective issue is I think there is some validity to it, but not every situation is going to follow each of the explanations that he offers. So, to give you an example, as you guys know, we talked about a few weeks ago, I tested positive for COVID, and I was quite sick for the week that I had COVID, especially the first few days. That stunk. It was awful. It was not. It was as the cool kids say now. 0 stars. Don't recommend. On like the Yelp review. To me, it was bad. To the COVID virus that was inside my body, it wasn't such a bad time. To COVID, it was great. It had a nice home to make its way in for a while. That's, I think, what he means by perspective, is sometimes we see suffering, we see evil in our tunnel vision of our own personal experience, but there might be a larger picture beyond that we don't see, that some of what we see as evil might not be evil otherwise. So as the Zohar says, what's an act of deen, what's an act of judgment for one person is an act of chesed or kindness for another person. Now, does this work for childhood cancer? No. Does this work for, I'm trying to think of another example, right? Does this work for childhood cancer? Not really. That's not really the perspective and the explanation we would go to for this. But that's a perspective to help us kind of keep in mind that what we see as a problem, or the other example that Cindy gave, of our friend Debbie Zichrona Livracha, falling and hurting her spine. That's not a matter of perspective. That just stinks. That might fall into a different category of explanation that he's going to give. But there are times when we just need to understand that sometimes what we think of as bad for us might not be bad in a larger picture. That's, I think, the point he's trying to make there. Esther, you look like you were going to say something, and then Cindy.
Oh, Cindy, go ahead. Cindy, go ahead.
Thank you.
I just saw you first, Esther.
Yeah.
No. So then, how does he explain the circumstances of his children? How does he explain that?
So he does get to other, before we go on to the other ones, other questions on that. I will come back to that.
Okay. So for me, this chapter is mislabeled. Either the chapter is mislabeled or the content is not dealing with the issue of evil. Cancer is horrible. It's not evil. I understand perspective when it comes to life sucks sometimes. But evil, to me, is something separate. And the question of evil, how do you even define evil? And is evil, innate? Is there something evil about people? This goes on all the time. Is the person mentally ill who shot up, 1 million children at Sandy Hook? Or is he evil? I think these are the issues that when I think about evil that I struggle with. And I think there is a completely separate chapter on suffering and loss and the sort of tension in life. And to me, he tries to use evil and suffering interchangeably in this chapter, and they are not for me.
So I hear you. And I don't disagree with you either. I think the only thing I can really say is I think there are a lot of people in the general public who do equate the two, and suffering and evil as together. And I think he's addressing more of what their argument is more than what your argument is. I think, and he is going to cover some of that in the next couple sections of human nature and where do some of these things come from. Judaism does affirm traditionally that we have two inclinations. We have an inclination to do good and an inclination
You're working on it. Is anything done?
I got one bar.
and each of us has each of those inclinations. So that's, I think, a little bit where he's going to go, is that while he doesn't use Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Hatov here, I think ultimately that's a little bit where he's going is, we have an inclination to do good and an inclination to do evil, and we constantly have to make the choice of which one we're going to do. Cindy, what were you you had the comment we'll come back to in a moment. Stuart.
I'm sorry, I won't be able to be on this call very long, but it really, as reading the chapter, it reminded me of the Christian dogma of the original sin, and that part being evil and the devil. These are concepts that we don't believe in, I think, being as Jews. So I sort of agree with Esther. I mean, I think that they're separate. and that you may have an inclination. That doesn't mean you're going to do it. I mean, you have choices, and we've talked a lot about choices, free will that we have. But I don't think that we're born with it, born with evil, and we don't have to ask for forgiveness for things like that. So I'd be interested in your concept about the difference between Christianity and Judaism in this regard.
So I'll just say briefly is that, some branches of Christianity, I don't think original sin is in every denomination. I think there are some who outrightly reject it. But those who believe, there is a concept, that we have, every person is born with a taint of, like, as a sinful person due to Adam and Eve's transgression that gets passed down generationally through all humanity. Jews tend to take the opposite view, that being created in God's image, we have original sanctity, for, just to play on the same term, that each person is inherently holy and has to, has to live up to that divine image in their life. So it's not, Jews don't believe that, we're burdened with some kind of inherent genetic sin that we have to overcome. Rather, we are burdened with some inherent sanctity that we have to live up to, which is our goal.
I agree.
So, all right. So, I don't want to say that I'm defending Rabbi Artson's choice of evil versus suffering. I do hear the argument, and I think I do agree with, you, Esther and Stuart, that suffering is not necessarily evil, and suffering is suffering, and evil is evil. And he may have mislabeled this chapter. I hear you. I agree with you. I think he's just speaking to the way I think most people, or at least philosophers, think of this. And that, like, when you think, why do bad things happen to good people?
Well,
that's the general gist of what he's trying to argue here.
it seems to me that he's dealing with that concept that we often have, and that I often get when reading prayers, and it's the tit for tat sort of concept. And that is what I think the book is about, that it's not about tit for tat. And that, when I think about that, and I think about the prayer book, and I see that we're going to address that later. He talks about prayer in later parts of the book, because prayer becomes meaningless then. Because prayer is, when it's not about praise, and the praise is about tit for tat, even if you want to take it that far, that's where I get into trouble. Where does prayer fit into this? But I'm willing to off for a few months.
So, we'll keep working on it. Now, in terms of suffering, so then we get to the question of suffering, which is, more what this chapter is about. So the first one is, that's life. Life, the world is dynamic, the world is changing. And so some of what is happening with suffering is just the side result of living in a dynamic world. So, people get older, and, our bodies change as they get older, and they don't work the way that they used to do when we were younger. That stinks. It's all, it's not fun, but it's part of living in a dynamic world. Part of one of Cindy's questions before, sometimes, part of living in a dynamic world is that genes mutate, sometimes randomly, as far as we can tell, and those mutations sometimes have a beneficial effect, evolution, and sometimes they have a negative effect, which lead to childhood cancers or other things. That something in the body just reacts in a way that this is what happens. And there's really, does it solve the problem? Not really. It just says it's part of the world we live in, and it's awful that this is the result of the world we live in. It's just the world we live in. It's on some level, I prefer this explanation to, others, because it's kind of a part of the natural order of things. It's awful, but it's not a punishment either, which, to Rabbi Artson's point, what could you have done to deserve some of these things? Diane, you look like you were going to say something.
Right. So I'm finding this discussion in the chapter really interesting because every time I think I really get it, I don't get it all over again. So I am all over the board here. So what comes to mind is what I came into this chapter with, and that is I always feel like my thoughts about all of this are so immature because I'm grateful to God for everything that I have. And for things that don't go my way, I ask God to help me through it. Now, if He's given me all the good stuff, why am I not looking to Him for all the bad stuff? That's number one. And number two, I recently gifted the book, The Women's Prayers for those who are suffering from October the 7th. If God didn't prevent that, then what are we doing praying to Him to console us and make it better when He obviously wasn't in charge of preventing it from happening? So I'm going zigzag. Does that make sense?
I mean, yeah, in some ways, having I think you used immature. Is that what you said? I'm trying to remember the word.
Yeah.
An immature view can be comforting. It can be a good way to live through life, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there is issues where you struggle with it. If you're going to thank God for the good things, then you have to wonder, why did God send you the bad things too? Which is a little bit what I think Rabbi Artson is struggling with too, is, okay, so, why is God sending us the bad things? Or is God sending us the bad things? I think is actually the question he's really trying to ask. And he's trying to make the argument God doesn't send us the bad things. God is, God gave us the world, and, we are partners in what we create that world to be. TK?
I think the problem is that we are trying to fit our experience into a construct that assumes a conscious being, and even Rabbi Artson doesn't, or so far has not postulated that. He has said that God is an organizing energy or force. Okay, and if you stay with that, then you don't have these problems of why is good and evil happening, because an organizing force is simply that. It's a creative energy. It's what drives the world and drives us. A child is born neither, in my mind, some children exhibit what we would label as good behavior. They seem naturally inclined to share. etc. And some children are born and don't have that, and there's nothing wrong with that, because that's also a survival instinct, for me, and have to be taught that. So I think it goes back to it's our choice whether to believe in either just an organizing vital energy in the universe, but the good and bad stuff is what we put on it. It in my opinion.
I find some, I laugh and find some irony in there, in that, so much of Rabbi Artson's conversation is about, responding to the choice. And you're saying, you have a choice too. You can have this creative force that's organizing the world, or you can, believe in that personal God that, is, controlling everything. That's a choice too. Yes. And, I think I don't think Rabbi Artson's ignorant of that. I think he's quite aware that that's a choice. He's offering an alternative to what I think many of us grew up with. Yes. Yes, Esther.
I want to address Diane's issue maybe a little bit more. And I think, you find that maybe it's inconsistent that you are grateful to God. But I think that in my own personal world, according to Esther, part of
the book of Esther, so to speak.
Yeah, the book
of Esther.
Part of the choice is choosing to be grateful, as well as how you respond to the bad things, and asking for God, the lure, if we look at it that way, for guidance on how to deal with the suffering. I'm not going to deal with evil right now, but with the suffering, because to me, that's really where God, in the form of my ancestors and whatever wisdom is stored back in that place of unknown, that's where I'm looking. And, my personal philosophy has always been that may the things I suffer with, not because I added to the suffering, but because they just are, shit happens. And whatever my response is as good as it can be. So, if I have a child with cancer, instead of being angry at my husband for his family genes of cancer and screaming at him all the time, or fighting or whatever, that we pull together and try to make the best of a horrible situation, and that you pray to the lure. I won't call him God anymore. I'm now going to call him a lure, like I'm catching a fish.
That's because he's very alluring.
Yeah. That's for me the concept of trying to deal with suffering and looking to this whatever power for guidance.
So are you looking to God for comfort, or for help, or for everything? Or when you're praying, what is it you're looking for?
First of all, I will admit that there are certainly moments, pray for this child to be well, pray for this airplane ride for us to land safely. Obviously I'm doing that. And I know that that's maybe not real. But I think it's more how to help me be the best person I can be in this situation, whatever the situation is. Help me find a way through this.
So just to add to what Esther's saying, two things. One, to her first point, the Mishnah says in Brachot that you're supposed to offer God a blessing for the bad just as you do for the good. So when bad things happen, I say, Judaism is a blessing for everything. When you get good news, there's a blessing, you say. When you get bad news, there's a blessing, you say.
What we do is say, this is bad, but it's not going to last forever. There is going to be an end to it. So that's my prayer, is that let me look at the end and not what I'm going through.
But so, there is a sense of, you acknowledge both. But to Esther's last point of, blessing, may this child be healthy, may this child, grow up strong, and feeling like, not necessarily in your control to do that. But on some level, I think about it this way. What are you actually asking for when you do that? You're, in some sense, it's helping you understand what you need to do and who you need to be to help that happen. So what, can you control it all? No. But can you help, can that prayer help you be in touch with those attributes and characteristics that are within you that will help this child be able to do that? Does that make sense? Yeah. To put it slightly differently, when I was a teenager, my rabbi, Rabbi Victor Merriman, once taught us, you can't pray for an A on your test. God's not going to give you an A on your test. You can pray for the wisdom to retain the information, the discipline to do the studies, the strength to stay up late to continue your studies. God can help you with that. God can help you access those attributes. God can't give you the final result. So that's part. So I do want to make sure we get back a little bit. So to the answers. So one answer Rabbi Artson says is that some of suffering is just built into the world. Our lives are dynamic, change happens, and I think this is part of where he'd say, why does he have a child with autism? Because that's how this child happened to be born. That something happened in the genetic coding of this particular child that caused him to be on the spectrum. That's kind of where it ends up. The second answer, he says, is for lots of different reasons. Sometimes we just make poor choices. Sometimes we can't resist the urge, and sometimes we don't have all of the information. So, the example I usually like to give for this just is, somebody who smoked 5 packs a day for 30 years and is diagnosed with lung cancer shouldn't be able to turn to God and say, "Oh God, why are you doing this to me?" It's, well, there's an actual cause and effect that took place here. The lung cancer was an effect of the smoking you did for all those years. And to the same point, at some point, 30 years ago, we might, well, say 40 years ago at this point, we might not have known what all the side effects of smoking were. We did not necessarily have all of the evidence. And so some of the choices of smoking were lack of not having all the information. And so the choices were made based on the information we had available without knowing the larger picture. And now we're suffering because of a consequence of the choices we had made previously. Questions? Make sense as an answer?
It does make sense, except there are people who are born with an inclination to their personalities or their genetic makeup. So that is the way they were born, like a child who's born with autism, and they have a different struggle than those who don't have that.
Correct.
So that's
correct.
that's a whole.
Yes, and they still have a choice to make of it's more difficult for them to make those choices sometimes, but they still have a choice. Yes, Karen.
Okay. Everything was going good, except I got, well, in this era of conspiracy theories and truth being revealed. I mean, there is, there was, there was suppression of the effects of nicotine
Absolutely,
by
yes.
human beings, and yeah, and sugar, and so the human being and the evil word, I don't know, the that word in Hebrew, the evil impulse, it's there, it's alive and well, and we are living in a world with that right
Yes.
now.
And not disagreeing, I think, but I also don't think Rabbi Artson would disagree. I think on some level, um, yes, one cause of suffering is our own choices. And sometimes the cause of suffering is the choices of other people that we, whether they intended to or not, um, we sometimes are hit by we're hit by their decisions, whether or not they intended for us to be hit by those decisions. Um, so we're affected sometimes, whether or not we think about that when we're making those choices.
Right.
So
Thank you.
so for me, that's kind of the way between these three, I think there's a lot that covers a lot of the causes of suffering. Is sometimes, yes, we are suffering, but we lose sight of the fact that there might, just because we're suffering doesn't mean that everything's bad. It's, again, I was suffering. The COVID virus was having a great time. It was having a party. Um, Sometimes it's a matter of perspective. Sometimes it's a consequence of choices, and sometimes it's just the product of living in a dynamic world that's ever changing. And that's, as the title of that subsection is, that's life, the nature of being human. Um, Sometimes the mutations are beneficial, sometimes they're not. Um, Thoughts, comments, questions? I know I still have to answer TK's question from the beginning. I have not forgotten.
Not
But
forgotten.
yeah.
But what you just said makes me think of the kind of Buddhist philosophy, which is that our suffering is caused by our desire to make these things make sense.
Yeah, possibly. And I was talking with a friend yesterday, and was saying, sometimes suffering is because we don't want to accept what reality actually is. Sometimes suffering is resistance to reality. We think things should be different than they actually are, and we're distressed by the fact that it's not the way it should be. Well, all right, that does, being distressed by it doesn't actually help much unless you start doing something to make it that way, to bring it closer to that vision. So, and you can't really start changing reality to be closer to that vision until you accept where it is in that moment. So, yeah, I don't think I necessarily disagree. Um, To come back to TK's question before of, it's to remind everyone of the question. He says on page 33 that process theology allows us to recognize the source of choices as within nature and not as the judgment of the punishment of divine. This allows us to perceive God as our ally and source of strength, and to freely choose to affirm those relations that bring us strength, joy, and implementing the divine lure before us to freely choose to affirm those relations. What I don't think he's suggesting that the bad choices are within nature and the good choices are coming from God. I think what he's suggesting is the choice itself is proximate within nature. I don't think he's saying, one choice is divine and one choice is, just a consequence of nature. I think he's saying both are within nature. When I choose to eat apples and oranges and pears and grapes instead of chocolate and sugar, I'm making a choice that has a natural consequence on my body. What he does suggest is, God wants us to eat the fruit because that's healthier for us and it helps us better able to fulfill God's will and helps us better be able to create a better reality, and be better partners with God in creation of the world by being healthier and allowing us to better sustain ourselves to do that. But the choice is still inherent.
Why do we need God in the picture to make that choice? Well, I mean, we know what is healthy. We happen to have the information to us. So, why aren't we just relying on our own ability to predict consequences?
Stephen?
That's really my question. In all of this theology, why do we need God? I mean, why do we need God? Because it's exactly what TK said. It's all up to us and our communities and our friends and our families. So why do we need God? Like Esther was having, issues with prayer. I mean, what are we praying for if it's not an omnipotent and omniscient entity that we're praying to?
Eddie, did you want to chime in before I answer?
Yeah, I do. Response to Stephen's question, I think that we need God because God's given us the foundation, I think, to deal with all those things. He's given us the law and the rules of how we should act. And I don't think those are independent of just ourselves. I think over the centuries, they have been ingrained in us because we have tried to follow the law, to follow the Torah.
So I think my response, actually, I think that's a good base on which I was going to respond also, is first, I think there's three answers for me, at least. I think one is God has given us this world. God has given us this creation. God is the one who set the rules that cause this. So through our relationship with God, we can help better understand what's going on in the world. How do we know the rules that we're living by are, in some sense, God created rules, with God as the creator. Number two, to Eddie's point, God gave us advice and suggestions and ideas on and rules on how we can best live in this world that God gave us. God created this world, and God said, here's a way to be successful in this world that I have created for you. And I'm not sure it's necessary. The rabbis say there are some laws that you would have, if God had not commanded it, we would have figured out on our own, but not all of them. Some of them, we needed God to decree for us because we would not have figured it out on our own, and God's trying to help us be able to do that. And third, as Rabbi Artson says, it allows us to continue to perceive God as our ally and source of strength in times of tribulation. When those bad things happen, as inevitably they will in life, it's nice to know that there's a being there to help us and support us and guide us on what to do next and how to respond. Otherwise, you're kind of left alone in the dark, and that's a scary place to be in. So, yes, we have our family, we have our spouses, we have our communities, we have our friends. Yes, they can help prop us up. And as I think Rabbi Artson will get there, Martin Buber kind of made it famous.